else, but right now, SuperTalk Mississippi Media's General Counsel and Chief Operating Officer joins us right now, Ashley Fortenberry. I asked Ashley if she would come in and talk to us and try and help us make a little bit of sense of what we talked about yesterday as it pertains to Brian Harsin and Auburn and implementing a new employment policy and all of those things. And she tried to convince me that we should not do this because she's a lawyer by trade. And I just kept on twisting, and she's like, okay, fine, we'll talk. Hey, Ashley, what's up?
Hey there. I'm so happy to be here, even after all of your arm twisting. Yeah.
Well, Deuce McAllister joined us a little while ago. We talked some Saints with him, so you're late for that party.
Well, you know I'm a big Saints fan, so I miss Deuce, but I was studying up some more on this Brian Harsin issue, which is, of course, the sports topic of the last week. So
yeah, and fascinating stuff. So yesterday, Auburn adds to its employment policy, employment manual, that university employees, for everybody through its university system, must cooperate with any internal or external investigations that are started by the university, and failure to do so could lead to punishment up to and including termination. And it feels very directed at Brian Harsin because of all that's going on. Just kind of surface level first, when you see this, what's your reaction?
I think people's first thought is that because of what's going on with Brian Harsin, that this policy was directed squarely at him. I think what we have to think about is the broader picture of the investigation, and the fact that this policy may have been instituted in order to capture some employees who may not be under any type of contract or any contractual obligations that put them in a position where they're required contractually to cooperate and participate in the investigation. I think you could have had a situation, and again, I want to put a disclaimer out here that a lot of this is just conjecture, and there's a lot of rumors being spread around right now. So exactly what's happening, no one knows. But I think what you could have had is, in the process of this investigation that's ongoing, you may have had some lower level employees who were not subject to any kind of contractual obligations, because I think it's possible to make the argument that Harsin's contract contains already some obligations of participation. But what legal could have realized is, okay, hey, we've got other folks. We've got people who could have been in the training room and witnessed abusive verbal behavior. We've got some people who are employees of the university but don't have any of those type of obligations existing contractually. And so I think a quick, easy way to say, oh, this is pointed at Brian Harsin, this is wrong. But I think the reality is this is probably trying to cast a wider web. That's kind of my initial takeaway in thinking through this a little bit more. There's certainly, there is, and it's perfectly acceptable for a company to decide to issue a policy and expect employees to follow it. A good example of that recently has been during COVID. We obviously know people started employment well before COVID, and then COVID came, and companies had to establish COVID policies and principles, and employees were expected to comply with those. And if they didn't comply with those, they could be subject to discipline and things like that. So just the fact that they issued a new policy, I don't think that, of course, is nothing out of the ordinary. I think just the way that the circumstances happen. Again, this is just my thoughts on it. It could very well be aimed at Harsin, but I think we have to think a little bit broader than that, and that it could likely be aimed at some employees that they may want to talk to as part of this investigation that may not have any contractual obligations to cooperate.
If when all of the dust settles, Brian Harsin is fired by the university for cause, and let's say that the for cause is failure to cooperate with a university investigation, does he then have, and I know you can sue anybody for anything, and we know that ultimately there's going to be litigation that's tied to if he's terminated, there will be litigation, assuming they don't work out a deal in advance. Would his representation have a good case to point to this and say, you enacted a new policy on February 8th after you admitted that you were investigating all that was going on in the football program and the entire public knew you were trying to find a way to fire him?
I mean, I think that, the bottom line is I think we all know that this is probably headed towards some form of legal action at this point.
Okay.
And I think they will throw everything that they can to point out that this was a hit job and that he, of course, now he's claiming that that he's done nothing wrong. And, so I definitely think that they could point to this policy. I do think that that if the university feels like there's enough language outside of this new policy in their contract that allows them to say that he should have cooperated in this investigation under other obligations, then they'll certainly point to that. But I definitely think, it certainly got people's attention, and, the old saying, it kind of smells bad. But again, I think this could be the situation where they are going after additional folks who are not necessarily under any kind of obligation contractually. So
you and I were talking earlier today, and you said this may be a situation where it's untenable to go forward for Brian Harsin. He can say, look, my legs have been cut out from underneath me. There's nothing I can do. I can't continue to lead the program. And I kind of gave you a hard time when you said it would make the most sense for them to settle. And my thought was, but if he hasn't done anything wrong, why should he settle? Why shouldn't they just have to pay him $18,300,000 to walk away?
Well,
and you actually made some pretty good points as to why that might make more sense to not do that.
Well, I think at this point you would have to evaluate where we are. I think my point in potentially reaching a settlement agreement in some kind of settlement is you have to think about not just the financial ramifications that you can actually quantify as far as saying, okay, I'm owed $18 million. But what you have to think about is how much is the value of my reputation decreasing based on all the allegations that are being thrown around because I'm in an untenable situation.
And it doesn't matter, frankly, if the allegations are true or not because they're out there?
We're talking a little bit different. Obviously, he can try to vindicate himself and say and ultimately prove that none of this was true. But we all know with social media and everything else, people hear certain things and rumors are flying. And so I do think there's a value or could have been a value. Now, of course, we're kind of way down the road at this point. I think this would have been better when this first started swirling is for both parties to kind of sit down and say, okay, can we reach an amicable solution where we don't drag both parties through the mud? Because ultimately we know, the potential is Auburn through this incident, it's going to be harder potentially to hire a coach because of all the circumstances surrounding Brian Harsin and all the things that have come out during this process. And then we also know that there's people that would steer away from hiring Brian Harsin in the future because they see and they, whether they're true or not, they have in their mind all the allegations that were swirling around Brian Harsin. And so I do think there could be a value at some point. But, it could be that Brian Harsin feels so wronged that he's just going to ride it out and say, I want my money, fire me, do what you have to do, and we'll fight it in court. I mean, we know, I think, what was it, Jeremy Pruitt and got fired from Tennessee. Yeah. And, I mean, we haven't seen a lawsuit filed yet, but there's been a lot of talk about a lawsuit coming. These things are inherently messy when you get into firing for calls. And so I do think that particularly early on, there could have been a value to both sides in trying to reach an agreement and sort of avoid all that we've seen take place over the last couple of days.
And generally speaking, if you go into the lawsuit and proceed all the way to a trial, there's going to be the airing of dirty laundry, and that tends to not work out so well. I mean, maybe that's ultimately the reason that either side would want to come to a settlement?
Well, and that's something you and I talked about, and I think, it's not only you get into discovery and you're talking about, potentially hundreds of thousands of documents depending on all the various claims. The cost of litigation, the disruption of, particularly for a university like Auburn of that size, when you're talking that many individuals, and you could get into a scale that's pretty large there. And so just the cost of all of that's involved, and emails. And, I can tell you, based on my time in private practice, you would be shocked at what people put in emails. And so that you just know, even though you teach people and go over again and again, please, make sure every email is something you wouldn't mind the whole world seeing. The fact of the matter is there can be a lot of things in writing that you don't want to come out. So
great stuff.